we're waiting for, but I think let's crack on. Let's do introductions first of all. So, and then we'll get into the topic, and I'll explain the format for this morning in terms of how we're going to sort of plan this all out with the time we've got. So, well, Fiaza, do you want to introduce yourself first of all?
Hi, my name is Fayaz Khan. I'm a presenter on the Tribe Tech podcast for Tech Southwest. I also write for SW Tech Daily, but I'm also a BBC journalist and a social media consultant for my own company.
Thank you, Fayaz. Abs.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Abs. I use they, them pronouns. I'm an AHRC funded doctoral researcher at the universities of Bristol and Exeter, and I'm researching the intersection between autism and gender in contemporary literature and culture. I also teach English literature at Bristol.
Fantastic. Thank you, Abs. Vikram.
Morning. I'm, of course, Vikram. I work at Sigma Polaris, and I'm the recently appointed head of diversity consulting there.
Fantastic, thank you. And Nemo.
So I'm Nemo. I'm having the joy of working with research like Abs at Bristol, working primarily in rationality theory, and then I'm working in the industry also on diversity and combining tech and diversity, both of which are very enjoyable.
Thank you, Nemo. And finally, Tom, please introduce yourself and welcome.
Yes, good morning, everyone. My name's Tom. I work at Hewlett Packard Enterprise in transformation. Previously to that, I was at Vodafone for 9 years, mainly in human resources roles, transformation roles, and I'm an ox-psych by background.
Fantastic. Okay, so welcome everyone, and we're using the Hopin platform. Chat on the right-hand side. We want your questions and points, and we want to be as interactive as possible with reflecting on what we're talking about today, which is all around gender and sexuality, and well, the great divide in terms of tech and academia. So I'm Dan Pritchard, co-founder of creative marketing agency Athlete Media that work in tech, education and government, and also co-founder of Tech Southwest, the only tech cluster organisation for the whole of the southwest of England. And we're delighted to be supporting this event organised by the student-led research group Gender and Sexuality Cluster within the South West of Wales Doctoral Training Partnership of the Arts and Humanities Research Council, which is quite wordy but very important. And various universities involved in that: Aberystwyth, Bristol, Bath Spa, Cardiff, Cranfield, Exeter, Reading, Southampton, and Newry, West of England. So hopefully I've mentioned them all. If not, Nemo will correct me, I'm sure. Just so you know, today's panel is being recorded. And then we put that out as a resource on the Tech Southwest YouTube channel. As I said, please use the chat function. Please use it. Be respectful. But ideas, thoughts, reflections, links to resources, all welcome. Tech Southwest is a free kind of tech cluster for the Southwest of England. So do join. It's free. TechSouthwest.co.uk. You start to get information about events like this and other things that we're doing, including the annual awards, which has a commitment to diversity category. So I think my colleague Joe, who's around in terms of tech support, will add in some links around that. If you have any problems with the platform, the best thing really is to sort of come out and come back in. Chrome and Firefox work best around that. So really pleased to be hosting this today. We've got a great panel, which is fantastic. And I'm going to start with, I just put it in the chat actually, just to show how this kind of can reverberate and headlines in terms of the news agenda, I suppose, on the former journalist. So it's fascinating. So according to Daily Telegraph, an article today, okay, civil servants in Scotland are to be encouraged to add pronouns to their email sign-offs under plans for a transgender inclusivity drive. It says the Scottish Government is backing proposals that would ask its 8,000 workers to take a pronoun pledge. The panel don't know anything about this unless they're Telegraph readers, and making no judgment on that, but under which they would add terms reflecting their gender identity, such as she, her, or he, him. Then the interesting bit is, however, the paper adds that an internal survey found that almost 60% of staff were opposed to the idea, with comments such as stupid and authoritarian. So I think we should launch straight into the first question: what is going on right now? Let's start with the corporate world. Perhaps kind of turning to you, Tom. What kind of questions do you encounter about gender and sexuality in your workplace? Bearing in mind what we just heard there in terms of a workplace and a report, and who knows how much accuracy is in that. But Tom, it'd be really good to hear your views, and then we'll go around the panel.
Yeah, no, thank you, Dan. I appreciate that, and interesting to hear. And I know I haven't read the paper this morning. Listen, I think in big corporates there is a large amount of focus on all sorts of identities, and gender being one that has been playing out for a long time. To be honest, I don't think we talk about it enough on a day-to-day basis. I probably think we've lost a lot of traction because of the crisis that's been going on with COVID and everything. So I think even in big companies, whilst they are, generally tends to be pretty good at putting out a marketing message about what they're doing, the actual day-to-day discussions, I would say, and I'm primarily talking with my HR hat on here, in where we were focused on trying to push the agenda, and you do have to push it. So even in places like HPE, there are large numbers of employment groups related to pretty much everything. And even now we've just launched Slack, and there is a Slack channel for people who are interested in different colors of Lego brick, for instance, let alone anything really important about working in the organization. I do see the difference though between, especially with regards to the pronoun discussion, with regards to a UK-based company. So when I used to work for Vodafone, for instance, versus Hewlett Packard Enterprise, where I work for an organization that's 60-odd thousand, and the bit that I'm in is predominantly global. So I think there's only 30 of us out of 4,500 that are in the UK. And the pronoun discussion, and actually the gender and sexuality discussion, is barely talked about in other places. So you go to far-flung corners of the world, and it would be very tricky, I think, to have a discussion about this. I'm sure Nemo's smiling. I'm sure he'll check on this from other places around the world, and Vikram as well. But it's less of a discussion. This seems to be at the moment a US UK discussion predominantly. Right. I don't know, I might be wrong, but certainly
So let's jump to Vikram, because you've worked in that corporate world, working in that little tech space. In terms of how you're seeing it, or the questions you're encountering around gender and sexuality in the workplace.
Thanks for that. My background is in the city and Silicon Valley. And like Tom said, for a number of companies, this has been important. The whole question around diversity and the bit around the gender side has been very important. And certainly one of the things I saw when I worked at EY, for example, was lots of notices put up in the kitchen areas where, when you're waiting for your cup of coffee, you could read up the latest news or snippets or around. So what can you do? How can you be
a corporate kind of activity in terms of we're pushing things out there, we want to engage. I suppose then the thing is, does that then generate the discussion, the debate,
absolutely, because when you're waiting for that cup of coffee, you meet other people who wander in and getting their snack or drink or whatever else, and then you just have that corridor conversation. Through the lockdown, that's just disappeared, and we were, let's face it, most of us zoomed out, and you don't have these corridor conversations unless you actually set something up. And certainly in large corporates, that is lifeblood, because this is how you find out what's happening, what's important, what are other people thinking, and that's how you start changing the culture and ideas. And certainly, like what Tom said, certainly I had to be careful. I worked in financial services. There's a number of people that were switched on about this whole thing, and a number of people where you had to bring them along on the journey. And so the Telegraph article, certainly my first impression of it is, I don't think there probably wasn't enough time spent on informing people and bringing them along on the journey before they launched and said, you have to do the gender pronoun, because it's changing behavior. And
which if you think about that Telegraph, the headlines, you sort of put out, this is what we want people to do, here's a snapshot survey, what is this all about? That is sort of reaction rather than, is there an engagement plan there around, conversation, education, listening to people, etc. So I'm going to jump around to other people because we've got a lot to get through. Let's jump, but thank you, Vikram, really interesting. And Abs, let's jump to you then in terms of what about what you're seeing in academia? Is it very much like an academic discussion, or is it much more than that in terms of academic, practical, how you're working together?
I think in terms of day-to-day kind of access on campus and sort of seeing these sort of conversations happening in the libraries and the study spaces, it's very much student-led, and it's very I would say that it's quite an advanced kind of level of discussion. We have gender-neutral bathrooms at the university, and there are a lot of kind of signs similar to what Vikram was saying all over the university, talking about LGBT rights and trans-inclusive practices in the study spaces at the university. I do think these are very student-led, which is really great, because we've got like a lot of student associations here which are kind of pushing these things forward. But at the same time, I think that in terms of the wider academic sphere, it's quite a polarized debate, and it is something that is it's something which is always in discussion, I think, and you see a lot of it on social media. And I think it can lead to quite heated discussions, especially around pronoun usage. A lot of academics, the ones that I work with regularly, we choose to use our pronouns on Zoom, for example. It's almost become an expectation to put your pronouns in brackets if you're joining a Zoom meeting in the academic sphere now, which is quite nice. But
into the world of business, for sure, that is different.
Yeah.
If you had your pronouns there, you may even be asked, "Oh, that's interesting. Why do you do that?" Which is, you may, I think, because it is still in the minority in terms of that sphere.
Absolutely. I don't think it's necessarily something that occurs outside of the academy on a regular basis, and it's quite nice to be able to have that in this sector. Absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you, Abs. Right, let's jump around. So, Fayaza, so you're working in the media, Tribe Tech podcast, BBC journalism, running your own business consultancy, social media. So you're seeing a lot of this play out in those sort of public realms, I suppose. So it'd be great to hear your reflections on that and what you're seeing around gender and sexuality.
Actually, thanks, Dan. It's really interesting, because when you were speaking, I was thinking, actually, I have worked with 3 councils this year on their social media. And what I found, because normally I work with tech businesses, and tech startups are very forward thinking, and they're with the program, and they are much more inclusive and much more diverse, whereas councils in England, especially little ones, tend to be white male heavy. That's just what and they don't really, there's no space for other people, and even actually a brown woman telling them how to do their social media is not particularly welcome. So I can't imagine how they would react to being told that they should use pronouns, or even be accepting of it. It's just like, I'm sure there would just
also different views around any members of councils in the audience, because absolutely sure, but I guess within that as well there will be variety, in terms of, but
right. And then there are also, but there are a very small number of people who within councils who do tend to, I would say they are the ones who are driving this conversation forward, and it's very, very important. And I think for me as well, being a mom of 2 children, one of whom is questioning her sexuality. She's only 10, but she's still doing that now, and probably has been since she was 6. I think it's a super important conversation, and one that we need to be having at every single level and in every single organization, starting with school. Really, because I think this is something that's not talked about.
Famous as tech and academia in terms of thinking about that, but obviously you think about public sector and all the interfaces, from central government, regional government, and the very local government and hyper local as well. Those interfaces with communities, what have you, is absolutely key.
Yeah, because otherwise, what we're doing is we're marginalizing an entire population, an entire part of society. And how is that fair? I mean, it's 2021. We need to move forward, and we need to accept everybody.
Yeah, and we've got one to the point that Vikram made in terms of the lockdown, in terms of has that been a bit of a hurdle or a slow down some of the engagement and conversation around this potentially. So Nima, let's come to you. You've heard what others have said on the panel in terms of reflection on that, or your viewpoint in terms of what you see happening in terms of gender and sexuality in the workplace.
Yeah, I think we have some very good points coming out, and coming from the academy myself, I agree. We have an awful lot of student-led initiatives, and I think I would actually like to take the article you shared earlier, Dan, and combine it with some of the things going on in the academy, and some of the accusations sometimes coming from the wider industry and the wider world, which is I think a lot of time in the academy, we spend talking about terminology and definitions. And that's not actually a problem. Sure, we also need to talk about change and all of these things. But the reason I'm saying that is, say I come from Denmark, which is a very different culture. And when I came here, I found it quite interesting how someone might identify themselves the strongest with being, say, a Chelsea fan. If you asked, who are you? They would say, I am, you know, I am from Liverpool. I am a Chelsea fan. I am, with some quite like stereotypical definitions. And that's completely all right. Don't get me wrong. But what can happen in, say, the gender debate particularly is, say, if I come in and I say I am a non-gender, but if I said to someone, say, if I identified as a female, they might get threatened because they identify as female and say are cisgender, or say identify as woman, pardon, I'm far in my argument in my head. And they might feel that I am threatening their stereotype. I will make an extreme example, because in Denmark we say exaggeration enhances understanding. Say if I said I was a Christian and I performed a blood ritual, that might make a large portion of Christians people very uncomfortable, because they would say you act in certain ways, or there are certain features about you that we do not consider to belong to this definition. And this is why if we start adding pronouns and we use them differently from how people themselves use them without preparing them, like Vikram is talking about, we are actually threatening their identity as being a man or being a woman or being neither as myself. Yeah. And in that case, it's completely reasonable that they then go and say somewhat aggressively say, well, we think this is stupid, say according to the civil servants in Scotland, because they don't understand why is this happening, and they don't understand where their place in the world is if we remodel these definitions. Now, of course, we need to remodel them because we need to be inclusive of everyone. But we also need to appreciate, as Vikram is saying, that if we don't have the water cooler conversations, if we don't have this debate to be something that people understand, then what we're going in and saying is, I think that you identify strongly with, like being a Chelsea fan or being a man or a woman. I think you identify strongly with. We now say someone else belong there, but they are vastly different from your understanding. And then we ask them to just be embracive about that without giving them any knowledge and training. That's going to be very difficult.
Yeah, no, but and I think as a sort of communications expert, one thing I'm fascinated about is the mix of formal and informal, isn't it? Because it's all, it's an ecosystem, it's a maelstrom, it's opinions, it's views, and the formal structures and activity that happens, and the informal that then happens as well, and how does one support the other in a way that ultimately allows people to kind of go on a journey and move forward as a society. So I would, in terms of people listening in, do please use the chat. We want questions and thoughts, and have you, if you're able to do and keep an eye on emails as well, we totally understand. But the idea is we come do this panel discussion through to, I think I said at the start, through to around 11, and then we'll dive into the Q&A kind of stuff, and then we've got the networking part of Hopin. We can do one-to-one conversations with people as well. So that's the framework, just in case I didn't say that at the start. Okay, so let's keep this pace going. Really good, really interesting viewpoints and perspectives, I suppose, from different parts of society that we're getting, which is what we want. Vikram, you've got your hand raised, yes.
Yeah, so I'm going to put in another point around forcing people to use pronouns. Certainly in a number of organizations I've worked in, if there were people who hid their identities or their sexuality for a variety of reasons, and I'm not going to go into exploring why, but they were not comfortable to say that either they wanted to use a different pronoun or that they were gay, for example. And certainly working in the financial services industry, where everyone wears dark suits, white shirts, and maybe
one of the dangers of blanket policies. It can be agreed by groups with people with I suppose power and authority within organisations, so you hope are engaging and listening to different people across the organisation as well as wider society, then make decisions, and then when that plays out in reality, because there's so many nuances and so many, that is one of the big challenges that I think the corporate world has that challenge, because they might start with best intentions, and then those kind of things get adopted, and have they really kind of
and
made that point?
The point I'm trying to make is that there might be people who want to use a particular pronoun or announce themselves to the world, but they're not quite ready. And and that's another aspect, is the very community that sometimes wants to use the correct pronouns don't feel comfortable.
Yeah. So if we
think some of them.
Yeah, no, so if we take that point, I think, okay, so that comes down to awareness and engagement, and I suppose one of the big questions, perhaps come back to you, Tom, in terms of in corporate world, in the tech sector, in academia, but from your perspective, do you think people are seeing, truly believing that gender and sexuality awareness is important, and actually, and why that matters in that setting, I suppose? It's an obvious question, but it's like a key fundamental, isn't it? Because then everything else just comes out from there in terms of then carrying on the conversation and the activity and the actions.
Yeah, so I think I might be slightly controversial here, but in big tech corporates, where predominantly I've come from, rightly or wrongly, the most important thing is profit and customers and share price, and the reality, that is the reality, right? And people get a little bit anxious if you steer away from that path and start to go down other areas. Now, what people often, and it's been a long task to get people to understand, that clearly diverse teams, especially leadership teams, but also having teams where you are interacting at a customer level, that you mirror your customers, is an important part.
Is growing, isn't it?
Exactly. So that kind of reality around, I mean, we all remember the service profit chain and things like that, those analogies around, satisfied employees, satisfied customers, and making sure that you have those links. I think, certainly my experience has been that when you have, diverse teams from a leadership level down, they pervade then the organization and people see the value. And I think the focus has predominantly been on gender. Now, if you're in the US, and specifically in Canada, for instance, or California, rather, I'll give you an example. Obviously, they focus on ethnicity as well, so we have to track that. So it's a big focus on ethnicity, big focus on gender. Sexuality, though, is not really discussed. It's still in big organizations, it's still not really, it comes to the fore. It's more, and I go a little bit to what Vikram said, and goes back to the pronoun debate, is not everyone wants to say what they feel or they want to be perceived of in the organization. Quite a lot of people, especially people who are trans, are trying their best not to talk about it, or not to bring it to the fore. But I think
interestingly, you do hear some horror stories into the hitting the headlines about certain organizations and a lad culture, and companies angrily kind of denying that or reacting to that or saying we've changed. That is, in terms of people willing to stand up and say something and risk their careers, that is happening.
Definitely. And there was a very interesting article, just on a slightly different tack, but I'll take from a tech perspective. I think that there is difference in different industries, clearly. But if we talk tech, I think people in tech respect people's, we talk about technologists, distinguished technologists, people who are experts in their field. I think that goes beyond any gender or sexuality. It's just, are you recognized as being, did you come up with the internet? Did you come up with a cure for this? I think that is just, people respect that. Clearly, there aren't enough women in technology who are being recognized for it. And this was really pertinent to me, which I hadn't really thought of, was an article from, I think, chief technologist at Intel about AI and who are actually the coders developing AI right now. And what actually are we teaching our AI to do? Actually, it's predominantly, the stereotypical group of people that are coding it.
Yeah.
Actually, is that influencing how the AI is learning about humans? And we've seen this. I think Amazon had an issue with their recruitment software that was doing, historical data dumps, and it was all to do with, looking at history and seeing that males were more successful in certain jobs. So then it picked that up into the algorithms that then, So there's a lot of complexity.
I think that you hit the nail on the head there in terms of using a cheap phrase, but that whole kind of why does this matter? Why does awareness matter? Because if you're creating things, if you're making things, if you're in business, and if you're putting things out into the world, which have an interface, which have which have customers, which all of that, rather than it's just about doing it within the organisation and the cultural organisation. Actually, it's all those touch points, and and tech. Of course, the touch points are massive and huge and ubiquitous. Nemo.
So I'm a mathematician by background originally, before I branched into philosophy and wider. And I have had so many colleagues that are fantastic, brilliant minds, where if they came up with a solution, absolutely no one would care which gender or sexuality they had. However, Tom, I will challenge you slightly, and I would like to hear your thoughts on this. In the ideation stage, if a young female with a math degree comes up to a board and proposes an idea, will it be taken as seriously as when a young male? Sure, at the end result stage, I completely agree with you, and tech is better than many other places. But I do not believe that the treatment of how serious something is and can this person carry the project, I have seen very few organizations where I would say there was a gender equality at that stage. The stage you talk about, I completely agree. But that's after the solution has been found, not when it's proposed, let's go out and look, or let's go out and build. Do you have a comment to this, Tom?
I would probably concur with that. I think the interesting thing was it depends on, if I look at some of my old leadership teams versus some of them that I've been in recently, where the diversity of that leadership team is completely balanced and actually, completely changed it on its head. I think that person coming in to pitch to that leadership team would be successful. Historically, though, and in certain industries, I think you're probably right. But I also think probably it's been set up wrong as well. So the setup of the perception of what people will be coming into, and even the request in the ideation phase is more biased anyway. It might be more biased to a particular person. Now, would I look at personally? No, because clearly I look at much broader than that. But I probably agree with you, Nemo, to a point. I think if you are pitching to a male-dominated board, you will probably suffer the biases that board sees through. We see it in everything, don't we? But hopefully, if we can change the makeup of boards and leadership teams so that they are diverse, then you get better outcomes for sure. I think without doubt, women have had to work much harder to get recognised all through, not just ideation phase, but even for recognition later on. We've seen this in all the history, haven't we? And we see it with different races and different ethnicities as well. Their ability to be recognised and other people taking credit for them, unfortunately, has happened over history.
Thank you, Tom. I'm keen to bring this back into academia as well. So Abs, we've heard quite a bit there in terms of sort of, I suppose, the corporate world and how this is playing out or evolving. There are clearly differences between the two in terms of awareness, activity, and the student-led piece is very different in terms of employee-led activity within organisations. Are there lessons to be learned around that in terms of why is that? Is it because of the people that are attracted to academia, or is it actually about structures and how things are set up?
I think the nature of academia is to sort of explore ideas that are kind of circulating in society.
Exactly that
Yeah, it's almost coming from a different register, isn't it? And I think when academics are talking about, for example, my study is in English literature, so I'm looking at literary texts. But in order to do so, you've got to look at the ideas which form the way in which people come at these texts and how they're going to talk about their experience of living in this world right now. And that often takes into account how we understand gender roles, how we understand sexuality. And I think that one of the things that attracts a lot of academics to this field is because it allows them to think in an abstract form about these ideas to the most minute level. So what you often find is that a lot of academics writing about gender and sexuality are very, very exhibitionist and open about the fact that they may be LGBTQ. And in doing so, it encourages other academics to be more open in their expression, which allows them a much more open conversation about these different aspects of identity and how they may intersect with one another and how we make sense of them in the workplace and in society. And I think that for the students as well, this is something that is quite expansive for them, because they may be questioning their identities as young people, and then they come to university and they meet academics who are very open about this in their work, in their teaching, in conferences, and all the things that they're exposed to as young adults coming into these topics. So it allows a much more kind of open discussion, even if there is disagreement surrounding the nature of how people understand them. There's space in which to talk about them.
As I think, as a media representative on the panel, there's so many nuances around this in terms of the media kind of whether it's progress or how they report or sensationalize or get into there's huge variety out there, but clearly the role is key in terms of media in a broader sense, in terms of the extremes around social media, mainstream media. Have you seen change there in your career in terms of where we have been, where we've come from, and where we are going to be going?
Yeah, I think with journalism, especially in broadcast, where I mainly work, things are changing really, really quickly, and people are very, very keen to not offend anyone. And so even if they don't actually understand pronouns, or they don't understand the whole LGBTQ community, they still want to try and get things right. So immediately, they will do stories on it, and there are more stories happening on like local radio as well as national radio. And there's there's a lot of care taken to ensure that the correct pronouns are used. But just to talk about something that Tom said, where he said a lot of trans people sometimes don't want to talk about their identity, and but then Ab said that, well, actually, when you are open about who you are and you accept it within yourself, and then talk about it in the academic community, then other academics can talk about it. Well, maybe having the conversation is what gets people to open up. Maybe people who are thinking about their identity and are from the LGBTQ community aren't able to express themselves within a corporate setting because they don't feel like they might be accepted, or they're concerned about what the reaction would be, or it makes people uncomfortable. And I mean, sometimes things are going to make people uncomfortable. So, we have to start having these conversations as uncomfortable as it makes people, so that we can get it going. Yeah. That's just how I feel.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I suppose one thing is, if they're talking about pronouns or talking about trans, those conversations, where in the different environments we're representing here today, are those conversations? We talked about COVID and lockdown. Are those conversations happening? Are we on a sort of curve, but wide variety within that in terms of, I suppose, so Vic, from your side, the corporate world, tech world, is this something you really have to push, or is it sort of, no, it is naturally occurring because of society and the conversations and the media and what we're seeing and what we're talking to, I don't know, our friends about or children about, or is it it's a lot harder than that? You really have to drive this, and you've got to work hard to get it on the agenda of leadership teams.
I think before we start pushing this, one of the key skills I had to learn a long time ago was how to listen. Because my natural reaction to any problem is to fix it as fast as I can and to attack it with as much viciousness as I can.
That works when it's a leaking tap.
Sorry?
That works when it's a leaking tap in the bathroom, of course. But yeah.
Well, apart from leaking taps in the bathroom. But, DIY for me is destroy it yourself.
Okay.
But when it comes to people issues or people challenges or people opportunities, whichever way you want to look at it, the skill I had to learn was how to listen. And even after constantly being aware of it, I when Tom was talking and talking about this board level, when Nemo brought up this point about a woman coming and presenting, I remember I was sitting at the equivalent of a kind of board meeting, and we used to run innovation centers when I worked at EY. And this really well-prepared lady came to present, but she was a bit late and she was flustered and a whole bunch of other things, and came and presented. And she presented in a way that really irritated me because for a whole bunch of reasons. And afterwards, I turned around to a very good friend of mine, and I said, "That was just absolutely dreadful. What do you think?" And she said, "Shut up, Vikram." She was just really embarrassed.
Right.
She picked up on that emotional concern. This is, diversity on the ground. So, you always talk about, so what does that mean and why is it great? This is diversity in action. Is she picked up on the fact that this lady was nervous. And I went in programmed to listen in a particular manner, and she wasn't delivering in that manner.
Yeah, well, and that sort of links into that point. Well, interesting, maybe to hear from Nima on this. So, as you mentioned about education, and help and absence and students and so much activity going on there, which is really exciting and encouraging. We are taught in schools around curriculums, around subjects. In Scandinavia, there is some variety around it. Because you talk about listening skills. Listening skills are relevant for this conversation we're having right now. Listening skills are relevant to being good in business and good in academia and to engaging with people. And so creating, the environment for people to be able to kind of have the conversation and start to build the awareness, rather than this whole kind of, sort of clashing of, like write the survey, you're going to adopt this. No, we're not, and whether there's any, because underpinning all of this is individuals, isn't it? Whether in a work setting, an academia setting, a family setting. So, Nima, I don't know if in Denmark, whether the kind of, the fundamentals around sort of, I hate to call this, but the building blocks of good humans, is something that we do need to think about, because that feeds into tech, feeds into academia, and it's absolutely key.
Yeah, I think an interesting thing we've heard thus far was, say, in the academy, where we have an awful lot of student-led initiative, and where I must say I've been amazed of the level of knowledge and awareness on a lot of DEI topics that any student from any subject will often have, just because a lot of these things are being discussed. And we could say in the industry, I'm finding that an awful lot of boards and C-suite levels are getting workshops. So even if they might be more conservative by nature, they actually happen to know quite a bit, where maybe the overall earlier stages are slightly less aware. Where I think now that you're asking cultural questions of a cultural difference from Denmark, I think one thing that's really quite fascinating in Denmark is the openness and the willingness to be proven wrong in these debates. Where I remember, it's quite funny, it was before I came out to my mother as being non-gender. I had a conversation with her where she sat down and she said, we have gender neutral daycares in Denmark. It's not this norm, but they exist, where the children are not given a pronoun until the child themselves asks for one. The parents cannot enforce it. The children need to say, I would like to be addressed as he, she, them. And my mother was sitting there saying, and asked a question that I think summarizes an awful lot of this. She says, am I just being a little bit old school and a little bit narrow-minded? Or is this a little bit silly? But she meant it. Mm-hmm. And when I said, you are being a little bit old school and narrow-minded, she embraced that answer and started educating herself. Yeah. The funny thing was, she didn't know that she was sitting in front of a child of her own that was identifying herself as being, non-gender, non-binary.
Yeah. So that is self-awareness to raise the question for yourself, isn't it?
And I think it's a lot of this. I think sometimes I think there's many great things to be said about this country, but when I was 6 in television, I saw in Denmark between 6 and 6:30 on the national television, there is children TV. It's when the parents stereotypically cook and you put the kids in front of the TV. And there was an advertisement raising the question, which toilet should a trans woman use? It did not give you an answer, but it raised the question. Mm-hmm. I think in Denmark, one big difference to in England is in Denmark, people raise a lot more questions and they give a lot fewer answers. I think here, people ask for a workshop on, could you please explain to me the truth behind pronouns and gender? Yeah. And in Denmark, it's a little bit more, could we please ask and raise some of these questions? And there are advantages with either approach. As Vikram said, the fastest approach is, of course, just to give everyone the answers, make them accept the modern answers, and then off you go. But yeah.
How do you create the environment where it's okay to ask questions? It's okay to be to not know a lot of the information. That's relevant to academia and to business, of course. So I don't want to sort of jump in there, but how do you take the steps to create the environment where you can say that I'm really not sure about this? I've had no experience in my own life. I want to talk about it.
Say, for instance, if someone told me, say, Dan, if you told me a pronoun you would prefer, if it was all right to ask, okay, I will use that pronoun. Why do you use that pronoun? Asking that in this question seems like in this country, I think many would take as a great attack on someone's identity, because people assume that you come from a point of skepticism, but you could come from a point of just being inquisitive.
Yeah.
And I think changing over to being okay to ask. So, Tom, Vikram, Fayasa, Abs, why do you use the pronoun you use? Getting to that, so I think it's part of that. I think it's conversations like we're having right now, where people hear it and they realize, and then maybe in their studies or in academia, all of a sudden, saying, I wonder, would it be all right if I asked you, because I would like to understand why this is the case, or why you see that is the case. Just opening up to more questions. I believe that's the first step of the answer. But maybe I'm culturally biased, and we should just provide the answers directly.
It's really interesting to hear that, because some of the in Denmark would be a news story in terms of a gender neutral, kindergarten that was rolling out across England right now. That would make a news story in the Telegraph or certain media, in terms of reflecting on that or commenting on that or asking people's views on that. So that is a different culture for sure. Should we jump into specific around attitudes, say, towards trans men and women in your workplace? Are those actually negative towards their assigned gender or identified gender? Are you seeing shifts around that in terms of the conversation and the awareness and the acceptance? Tom, from your side, in terms of your corporate background and the ecosystem you operate in, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, it goes a bit to the previous conversation about how you increase participation in the conversation and allow people to be able to discuss more freely. I certainly, one of the things that having a lot of people in an organization of diversity means is that there are a lot of groups, a lot of forums, a lot of training, a lot of discussions, and actually probably to a degree heightened more by the fact that we're not getting into the office and we are actually able to, especially if you're a leader or a people manager and things like that, you have to interact in a different way. So I think from my experience, certainly, at HP, at Vodafone, they are pretty well recognised as sort of leading in this space, providing the forums and the places for people to discuss, albeit that it's within the groups. So the challenge with having lots of groups is they become sort of self-managed groups and can become a bit cliquey and not necessarily be the whole organisation. So when you talk an organisation of, say, 13,000 in Vodafone UK, because I use the UK example rather than going beyond UK boundaries, whenever you did an employee engagement session, you probably only get 10% of the organisation tuning in. It used to be one of our biggest challenges is how do you engage the entire organisation? Because in organisations, just by their nature, they tend to have various groups, don't you? People who are kind of, fully engaged, motivated, dedicated to the cause. They tend to be the 10% or whatever that go to these events. And then you've got the big middle who are there just to kind of do the job. I don't really want to talk about anything else other than just doing my job. I'm not really interested in the company.
Is that okay? Is that okay, or is it about trying to shift or trying?
No, it's not. What you want to do, of course, is if you think that's the reality, if it's a normative curve within any organisation, and actually 80% is just there doing the day job. If you could take 10, 20% of that 80 and make them more engaged, more high performance, and actually of that 80, some of them might be struggling with fitting in, their identity within the organization, how they feel they can be heard, how they feel they can be pitching to the board and things like that. If you can just move them, then clearly as an organization and as a leadership group, you want to move more of that population to the engaged population. There's always the disaffected minority, right? You're always going to have that.
So are we missing a trick in business? Because the question from Emma Marie, why is there this narrative that diversity and inclusion must come at the expense of profit and business growth? Because we know if we talk about profit and business growth within business, you will get people to the table, and you will get potentially a different mix of people to the table. So why is here is the diversity group, or I'm just sort of paraphrasing here, over here, and 10% engaged here, and here is growth and profit and targets and my individual performance, my team performance, my company performance over here. Surely we've got to do more to kind of build that in, rather than it's still having conversations around one or the other, or it's an optional thing I might have. If there's time, I will step into that space and have that conversation and go on that journey.
Yeah, and I don't think it's an either or. I think it's if you see the performance of diverse teams, they perform better without a doubt. I'm sure Nima and Vikram have got the research, but I know personally, having worked in teams that are very male dominated to teams that are very diverse on all elements, sexuality as well as gender, those teams are better performing. And also I would say as well, that have different ethnicities and different backgrounds. So not just white British, female white British, male white British, but actually of different diversities and different thinking styles and different learning behaviors. They create much more value to the organization, to the customer, and lead to better profit and revenue because they are diverse, because actually everyone has different views and perceptions and different understandings of the universe in which they live in. So if you can bring that to the boardroom and be able to then change your product set, change the way in which you look at your customer base, change the offer. So when I used to look after Vodafone in the Southwest, for instance, we looked at different offers, different ways of going after different populations, specific based on any data points that we had. They created offers in East London for Polish participants and customers because there were more in that particular where that store was. It's those sorts of things that lead to increase the price. But you just need to open the mindset. And the problem is there is a lot of boards are not diverse enough to be able to bring in and be able to take the step forward to say
that feels like a long road that we've been on for a long time already. So
it is.
Abs from your side of academia, because of where you're at now and looking ahead in terms of the trajectory around this, because I think it is. I think academia is ahead of the curve in business in many ways, because it is a place to explore ideas. Where do you see this? Very hard to predict, but in terms of moving forwards as the world sort of recovers from COVID as well, and the pandemic, in terms of how you see this continuing, with the formal side of things, the organisation of the groups, or the informal, and how that starts to feed into the kind of the mainstream, I suppose, around academia, and how we can learn from that.
Yeah, I think that it's about continuing the conversation and allowing it to continue freely, because I think that one of the sort of counter narratives which is going on in the academy at the moment is that there is a kind of oppression of freedom of speech, and this is coming from gender critical feminism, and they're what are culturally referred to in media as TERFs. So there's this kind of counter narrative towards kind of trans identities, which kind of situate some trans people as basically gender confused, and it's kind of fostered this trans panic, which also exists in the kind of academic sphere. And these conversations kind of run counter to the kind of really, really exciting understandings of gender and sexuality, which are also going on in the academy. And I think that one of the problems is that these conversations are getting very heated, especially at the moment, because we're out of the workplace, we're all online, everything's happening on Twitter, and people are just shouting at each other and throwing everything all over the place. And I think it's returning to, these are real people, these are people who have real issues of accessibility to medications that they need. They don't have the same rights that everyone else has to get for trans women to get the same hormones that cis women get for things like menopause, they have to jump through so many hoops. They can't just go to their GP. And I think it's about talking about these practical issues and how they affect people in real life, in a real tangible way, and not reducing the argument to which bathroom should a trans woman use. And I think that's where we need to kind of open the conversation, but also not necessarily expect trans people to have to educate cis people in the workplace on a day-to-day basis. I think as someone who is under the trans umbrella, I am asked a lot of questions about my gender identity, and I'm quite happy to answer them. But there are a lot of people who aren't so happy to do that. And I think that one of the things we need to think about is, should we have public speakers coming into workplaces as a matter of, it should be happening. These people who are trained, this is their life, this is what they do, and not relying on, the person in the cubicle next to you to have to explain everything there is about trans, because it doesn't tell us anything apart from their experience, which they may not want to share.
Yeah, and that's the mix in terms of, yes, the conversational, the multiple moments, have a great environment for that for all sorts of reasons is good, but also you then need the proactive decisions to do things, to bring that into the workplace, to go on that journey. And that sort of links to the point that Charlotte Finch-Lynn has made and asked a question in the chat. Thank you, Charlotte. Why do you think that there's always a minority that do not take part in surveys, the risk of being outed, not supported, or maybe they just can't be bothered? That sort of, I'm not engaging, or I choose not to engage, or I have my. Does anyone want to respond to that particular question?
I'll tackle it because every year, practically every company I've worked for had annual employee surveys, and as Charlotte said, there's always a small, and Tom said, there's always a small minority which just can't be bothered to engage. And whilst some of it is they can't be bothered, some of it, and I can't say what the mix is people feel, okay, I'll give all of these answers, but I'll never see any change.
Yeah.
And it's that sense of, what's the point? I'm going to put an effort into this and nothing's going to change. So it's all going to stay the same. And there's so much effort that has to be put into these employee surveys, understanding what it means, communicating it back out, and then showing what the change plans are, how we're going to change things. It's really quite difficult, which also leads to the other point that, when we talk about profitability and is diversity a challenge to profitability. Let's put a current day challenge right now that all employees are probably facing. There's people who want wage increases and the return to work. And can you work from home, or do you have to be back in the office? Now, if people are trying to tackle this is the most urgent, critical thing for them, for most businesses. And much as we would like it to be different, diversity is not going to trump those two issues. And very often in businesses, there are other burning platforms or critical things they need to go and tackle and challenge and fix.
Yeah,
that diversity is not important, and it's the smarter companies that figure out how do you build in diversity either as a social justice,
and maybe bigger. I think if you have to bring you in, you operate as a regional level with local clients, local councils. If you look at the southwest, we talk about the southwest of England. Number of corporates. There are many, but the number of SMEs, family-run businesses. You look at Tech Southwest, our membership. It's a really interesting mix of different sizes, from startups, from steady-state companies of sort of 10 to 30 people, as well as a few bigger. You start getting to the hundreds. And I think that is a consideration, because the organisation type size does shape some of the ability or their perceived ability to do anything about this in gender or engage or listen. And do you see that in your work?
I feel like in smaller organizations, these conversations are easier to have, but it's in larger organizations where people don't feel 100% safe because they don't know how things will how they'll be received. And so I think in smaller organizations it's much easier because, you know, there's a personal relationship. And so because of that, people are able to have very open and conversations. And also with smaller tech companies here in the Southwest, I see that they tend to be very open towards diversity and inclusion, from what I've seen anyway, especially, you know, when it's a startup and it's at the very critical, you know, just at the extreme startup level. But it's just when they tend to grow that becomes a bit harder. And a lot of excuses, I'm saying the word excuses, I hope it's the right term, but a lot of excuses that they use for not including people later on as they grow is because, oh, we can't find a more diverse workforce because as we grow, you know, the talent is just not there. However, having spoken to Nemo on the podcast, he says that's not really an excuse, because what happens is they tend to just look in the same places and they tend to use the same terminology and they tend to go to the same newspapers, whereas if they were broadening out their horizons and looking in more places, then they find the people that they need.
Yeah, these smaller companies, the first time they are, you know, do they create the policies and the culture early on? Does this arise because a single person raises the point or the question? You know, somebody who's joining or someone who is going through the recruitment process, but oh, this is interesting.
Yeah.
Use X or Y, you know, come into our sort of field of vision, you know, because I think, you know, some companies might be from the very start thinking about diversity within their workforce, within their how they set up their customers. Others, I have a feeling they don't, and then something emerges, and that's when, you know, they're on the back foot or they're being reactive.
Or they do think about it from the start. It's just that they aren't able to maintain that because it's not at the top of their agenda. And even last year, I think it was in the Tech Southwest survey, we found that during COVID, a lot of companies, diversity just sort of fell off the agenda while they were trying to deal with COVID. Why did it fall off the agenda? Why is it such a big deal? It just shouldn't be. It should just be part of daily life and conversation.
Nemo, I think you
cannot marginalize society in that way.
Absolutely. No, thank you, Fiaza. Nemo.
Oh, no, first of all, like, I completely agree with what you're saying, Fiasa. Like, if you only look in, and I'm going to use a stereotype I don't even understand, cricket. If you only look in your cricket club for people, you're probably going to find the same people. Now, I don't really know much about cricket being a foreigner, but I have some preconceptions about you finding the same type of people there. And I just, I thought I would like to raise two small points. One of them is I, on occasion, actually go with other. And I would like to explain why. Now, this is not the case like someone that decides to not vote in an election because they don't like parties. That's ludicrous. This is different. This is, there's two reasons I might go with other or prefer not to say. One of them is quite obvious. If there isn't a category for me. If it's, you know, man, woman, other. Or sometimes it's because I feel the questionnaire is written so poorly that I would rather in a comment section in the end explain why they asked the wrong questions. Like, for instance, if they say, what's your gender? Male, female. If they don't understand what they're doing, I'm not going to engage because I know the way they use the data later will be wrong. So if it's an undereducated survey, sometimes I will write a long article in the end of it about how they can do better. But I will choose other or prefer not to say because I don't want them to misuse my data. And I think there is one more point, and I think one reason some people will do this, and this goes into the point put in chat, which was really good, Charlotte, which was if a company is saying we want this so that we can target our improvements, I think many people would be more willing to put it in than if they don't know why the questionnaire is going out there. My reason for saying this is if you think that they might use the numbers to justify being pretty decent and therefore not having to do more, you might not want your number to actually help them not do anything about it.
Yeah.
And I think this, if an organization is not showing the progress and not showing we want to use this to do better interventions and to do better programs, but you feel maybe they use this for an audit so they don't need to change anything, I would definitely not help them with my number. So I could imagine, because there isn't interesting that like more people preferring not to say in old school organizations. And I think there is a couple of reasons for that. One of them is probably this transparency. Tom, you also mentioned, absolutely. And I think another point of it is, Tom, you have something to say to that?
No, yeah, I was just going to say, to this point and the point that Abs made earlier, we have to remember ourselves, there's probably a fundamental difference between working in corporate versus working in academia. In a corporate, they're paying for you, whereas in academia, you're paying for them to some degree. So the risk permission debate.
But is it true though? Is academia, as a lecturer or research post?
Sure. I'm talking more at the student level because we were talking about student activity. So in terms of the two differences, in an organisation, employees feel that they need permission to go and potentially create groups. So the organisation then, to then this point around doing something about a particular, wanting to increase diversity, for instance, it feels like it's an organisation top level driven thing. So some people just don't engage with it because they don't feel it's their ownership of it. It's a corporate goal. They've got to hit target. Versus student bodies, I'm talking students, not the academics. I'm talking a student body where they feel that they are able to, because they don't need permission to kind of create a group and create a upswelling of interest in something, because they don't have a consequence. Whereas in a business, if you go down a certain path, one of the things a lot of organizations are challenged with was actually, being active and engaged on things like social media platforms, actually, because quite a lot of people are quite scared to, because they feel that if they say something wrong, even if it's been in the best intentions, but it's been perceived as wrong. And I've seen this, and I've had to deal with this many times, where people have unintentionally had a consequence of something they thought was something minor that has then spread across social media and has led to people having to be fired, etc., or suspended. But people then stay away from it. So to this point about the Charlotte rate, people just feel sometimes in organisations, because there isn't a risk associated with standing up, they stand down, which is wrong, by the way. I'm not saying that's the right thing. This is just what I perceive as happening sometimes.
And that's really interesting, because you could say, well, there could be consequences for students. Vice chancellors and the leadership teams, they are running a business. They have a brand. They do not want controversy. They do not want media stories about student groups.
Well, they might do.
Really good to hear your Abs. Do you want to come back on that?
I was just thinking what you were saying, Tom, about people sort of being scared to kind of, be open about these things was really interesting in terms of academics rather than students. Because I think, like you said, in terms of students, it's almost a very different system. It's coming from a very different place. But one of the things that I've noticed in the academy from the researcher level is that I think there is almost a kind of pressure on some academics to come out in some way. Because I research autism and gender. I'm reading a lot of things by autistic researchers who have made the choice to come out as autistic. And the effect of that, it is a risk for many of them, because in doing so, they are exposing a lot of their personal experiences to the world, and same as if you're LGBTQ. And as a result, they may be making themselves quite vulnerable in terms of people coming at autism from perhaps a pathological paradigm rather than a neurodiversity one. They may actually question their ability to do the research and speak authoritatively on it. And I think it can be a similar situation for people who are speaking about LGBTQ rights. It's like, to come out may be liberatory in some ways, but in other ways it may make their lives very difficult in other ways.
In a minute, but where you say that pressure, where do you think that pressure comes from? Is it within academic circles?
I think that when you see other academics sort of situating themselves within the discourse, saying, I have the authority to write about this because I have these life experiences. And actually, I think there is something to be said about being able to talk about these things. But I'm also very much of the belief that if you do it respectfully, you absolutely can talk about things that you don't necessarily have experience of. But in order to do so, these people, they do come out, and I think it encourages people to come out. But I think for others, it may make them feel that, should I come out? Am I not going to be as authoritative if I don't come out as whatever identity position this is or what intersection we're talking about? But then obviously, like I said, there's this kind of counter problem that your life may be irreversibly changed and your reputation may be at stake in certain contexts, but maybe it would be better in others. So it can be it's quite a knotty subject. I think it can be very helpful, but at the same time, there are stumbling blocks, I think, that prevent academics from speaking openly about certain parts of their lives.
Absolutely, and I encountered this. I came out fairly late in life, and I had the issue that I was still extremely I never particularly associated myself as being man. I had a very weak gender, I just didn't really get it, which so to speak, and I felt a pressure on there with your people not wanting to listen as much if I seem to not be part of the group. I think
you also sit in sort of academia and in tech, in terms of how does that work in terms of your audiences? There's huge variety there. Do you have to switch, or is it no? This is me. This is how I engage. And
everyone, unless the extreme people on occasion, will make minor compromises. Hey, some days I'll wear yellow capes, another day I will wear a black T-shirt. And you have to choose which battles you take. Sometimes you are more evolutionary inside of it.
Yellow cape, but I feel slightly disappointed that I haven't seen you.
Well, actually, this is me showing up in a non-black T-shirt. It's a compliment to this audience. But it's a very true thing. Like you choose which battles you take, and some places it's better to first be heard and then start shouting, and other times you can start shouting immediately. And personally, I have to make that decision on a case-by-case basis, and that can be difficult. I would like to raise one final thing, because I know we're going into Q&A soon, which is to challenge an early point made, because we've gone and talked so much about gender inside of today's call, which has been fantastic. But Tom, when you talked about the importance of sexuality as well inside of the large corporates, and I would just like to share two statistics really with people, which is young people, with an ONS study from 2017, showed that 4.2%, that was between 14 and 27, I believe, 4.2% identifies as LGBT, where as opposed the census of 2011 only had, for instance, 3.3% of people of Black ethnicity so identifying. What I'm saying is, I think many people agree that our sexuality is extremely important to who we are. I'm not going to try and compare whether it's more important or not more important than ethnicity. It's completely impossible to do such a comparison, but we can agree it's pretty big. And actually, there are more people that identified in that direction than in the other. Arguably, that means that both so that you can represent your customers or consumers in the industry space, but also just sort of, it's actually quite a large group.
Absolutely, yeah.
And I think it would be good to have, if anyone in the audience have any questions related to sexuality and how that links into gender, because it's all about our identities and our behavior. And I think studies differ, but say transgender, several studies and apps, you might have some others, but seem to, on a population level, estimate this to be about 1%, but potentially, of course, with opening up, that could increase. But LGB is, and I'm personally not including T, because T has several different meanings, is quite significant and arguably something that should be put a little more light on. Anyways.
Yeah, and if you think about the Great Divide, and the headline for this debate around tech versus academia, again, tech and business in terms of segmenting your audience in sort of marketing terms and understanding your audience and being able to engage with them and sell products and services to them. Everyone in business talks about you've really got to understand, you've really got to listen, you've got to use big data, you've got to use all the tools and techniques available to understand your people, your customers, your potential customers. And yet in that mix, the diversity, sexuality and gender is there in some businesses, I would surmise, but in others, perhaps it's not. They're still looking at age, male, female, and putting people into these huge blocks and then developing whole strategies and spending millions and millions of pounds, and that goes out into society into the campaigns and activity and the messaging around that, trying to engage with people, hit trigger points around people, and a lot of the nuances are just not there. Vikram.
A couple of quick points, and I'd like to make these couple of positive points. We're having these kind of conversations much more than we had even 5 years ago, let alone 10 years ago, which I think is a wonderful positive trend. And I think that this is here to stay. And so I think we really need to recognize that. The other aspect, which I find actually really powerful, is quite a lot of the solutions, the tools, the approaches to dealing with this specific topic we've talked about is the same, whether it's ethnicity and a whole other ranges of diversity challenges. So, we don't need to go and develop a whole new approach of doing things. Quite a lot of the tools and approaches are the same. And whilst there might be individual pockets where you've got to change how you engage with people, like Nemo's example of, when you have the drop-down box and whether you put in Mr., Mrs., other, to have a little more nuance around it. Part of that is actually being aware and listening and engaging. And through that, you come up with better solutions. So that's the really positive side of things I'd like to bring out there.
Yeah, absolutely. We've kind of morphed into sort of questions from the audience are welcome. We encourage that, and thank you for making points as well in terms of people joining us today. But we'll keep the conversations going, and then the final kind of 10-15 minutes will the networking zone on the left hand side. We can open that, and people can just have one-on-one conversations, get to meet for perhaps the final 10 minutes through to the 11:30 close. And Feyaza and Panis, by the way, thank you for also responding to people individually in the chat whilst having a conversation live on the screen. So that's really impressive. So thank you so much for that. I suppose one of the things I like to ask myself and the organisations I kind of sort of work with, asking me to sort of the now, next, future. Where are we now? What's coming next? And potentially in the future. The big kind of exciting question marks around that. And maybe in terms of a roundup, whether each of you wants to take one of those in terms of a now or a next in the future, and what you see from your perspective as a sort of a summing up on a particular point on this, whether it's a challenge that we really need to kind of we're shying away from, or some positives that we need to build on. A now, next, future, in terms of taking one of those. And I'll give you 5 seconds to have a think about it, and then Feyaza, go.
Well, I think in the media, the narrative is created by the people. And so for the future, if we want the media to react positively and speak positively and also be more educated about this, then we have to create the narrative. So however we do that, it is up to us. And I think having conversations like this and debates like this, exactly the way forward. And that's how we get more people to talk about it. And also, I think being a bit more open and allowing, like, when Ab said, we should have people going into offices and doing this sort of education around these subjects. That is super important, including in media offices. We should be able to allow journalists to ask these questions so that they understand what it is they're talking about. Because quite often, and I'm sure you could probably tell when you know a subject really well, a lot of journalists don't know what the heck they're talking about because they've just learned that thing 5 minutes before.
Journalism courses now, I did journalism years ago, and we learn about local government, central government, legal, those kind of things, but this wasn't on the agenda. I'm talking a long time ago, of course. Yeah. Right. And thank you for being for part of the discussion today. Fantastic. So now, next, future. Nemo, your mic is live, so I'm looking at you then.
No, I think one thing we've heard here is two really interesting insights. It is in the academy, a lot of it is student-led, but also personally, I believe there is an awful lot of awareness going on. Yes, there is far to go, but I think it's really quite impressive. And in this country, as I believe that higher education is now like above 50% of the younger generation, this will feed into the industry. And we've heard from the industry, there's an awful lot. And simply just by the topics selected, both by Vikram and Tom in particular, we've heard that there's a lot of focus on the leadership diversity. And I think one thing to then take from this is to be expected over the next 10 years, we're going to have a top approach and a bottom approach, but the real focus should be the middle. we're having workshop for here. We have new people coming in being educated. How do we now go in and do, say, as Ab is saying, workshops and talks, like, but how do we use an up-down approach to get the middle converted so that we don't need to wait 20 years to get the new people the entire way up? And I think that's really the key learning, I think, from the discussions we've had thus far.
Thank you, Nemo. So Tom, yeah.
I would just absolutely concur with what Nemo said. So in my role, trying to drive culture change and transformation of an organization, you've seen quite a lot of organizations have, not bad, I'm never saying it's going to be great because it always can do more work, but on sort of leadership advocates and allies around all the particular groups right now, it's a kind of requisite of a board to be better shaped in terms of its diversity makeup, but also in terms of leading agendas within organization. And I think you do have groups out there in the bottom of the pyramid who are fighting their cause and wanting to influence. But in any change and any transformation, that middle layer, the first layer of people managers, is often, because you spend a lot of time trying to work on the leadership to get them involved, you spend a lot of time understanding the base through surveys, etc. But if you can't get that middle line to be the advocates and the real change agents, every transformation that I've been involved in over the last 25 years will fail. And so we spend, yes, in the 2 years I've been doing this at HP, top leadership, yes, strategy, yes, change programs, agile transformation, all of that sort of stuff. But actually the focus, it will live and die by that group. And if you can't buy that group, or I don't mean buy them as in buy their trust in you, but if you can't give them the education, give them the learning, give them the knowledge, actually on this particular topic, I believe, similar to do with ethnicity and other areas, you've got to give them the confidence to be able to have those conversations, be empathic leaders, listen, as Vikram said earlier, that is a skill. That is going to be the skill of the future, is being able to be, empathic, listening, and educated leaders. And I think if you can do that, then any business should be able to be successful, and any academics and bringing the next generation of people who might move between academia and into business will be more successful.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you for each of these sort of reflections is building on the previous one, which is fascinating, really, how we sum up this sort of last 80 minutes of discussion. So Vikram, and then finally Abs. So in terms of a sort of now, next, future, or a reflection on a particular point, I think then we're going to dive into some networking at the end. So Vikram.
So I'm going to pick up on what Tom said and just build on it. Is quite a lot of this is going to now depend on skills we develop for the future. So in the past, our technical skills were really, really valued. And we're at a point now where technical skills are not going to be as important as quite a lot of what I'm going to call our adaptive skills, in terms of understanding what's happening, dealing with it, and doing something about it. And going forward, that ability to adapt to what's happening, not only in the market, but in society, in the world, and as we engage with the wider world, we're just going to have to be more sensitive to differences. Because if we want to be this global leader, for example, in Britain, if we aren't able to be sensitive about gender and sexuality, how are we necessarily going to engage with other societies? The skills are the same. So if you want to go and sell in China, that ability to engage, the skills are the same as what we're talking about right now.
Yeah, there's awareness and listening and point of view. Yeah, well done for keeping politics out of it for today's discussion as well, everyone. It hasn't had a mention until now. Thank you, Vikram. Abs, final thoughts from you, I guess, on this sort of now, next, future, or a particular point that you've heard from your fellow panelists?
I think what Vikram's just said about adaptability is incredibly important. And I think something that we've had to do in terms of understanding different intersections of identity over time. I mean, over 100 years ago, just only 100 years ago, our understanding of how women existed in relation to men in society was very different. And I think we are continually having these conversations on how we understand ourselves as humans and how these different intersections of identity work. They're always going to be in process. And I think it's about having the confidence to have these conversations and looking at the concrete aspects of how these differences affect individuals' lives and how it allows them to live more authentically and freely. And I think it's about thinking about being authentic and living authentically, because it allows us to be happier. It allows us to live in a more satisfied way. And then it allows us to do our jobs better and engage with other people better. So I think maybe kind of calling back to what Nemo was saying about Denmark, maybe we should be learning a little bit from the Danish and, having the courage to say, actually, maybe I'm wrong about this. I'm going to listen, and I'm not going to expect this person to tell me everything. I'm going to go and educate myself as well. And I think it's that openness and this kind of organic conversation that we need to look forward to, I think.
That sounds brilliant. What sort of final summing up? And I think, the point you make, there's fundamentals. Why do we do this? Why are we having this conversation? It's about understanding, it's about happiness, it's about human beings across the planet interacting, engaging, and doing, great things together, etc. I think, that it can get forgotten and lost, into those absolute fundamentals around this whole, it's easy to become a media narrative over here or an academic narrative over here, and actually, step back and take about the bigger picture of why this matters, why we need to have this conversation to learn and progress, and ultimately happiness and acceptance across the board. So, fantastic, everyone, brilliant, really brilliant panel. Thank you, Tom, Faiza, Abs, Nemo, and Vikram, and especially Nemo for sort of pulling this together with the cluster group. And Nemo, I think the networking is now open. So we, those are just on the call, we've got through to 11:30. I don't think it cuts you off at 11:30 if people have got a few minutes spare beyond that. But the way it works, you go in there, I think there's a clock in the corner, and literally you can have a one-to-one conversation with someone, and then you can click the button to join with the next. And if you've built your profile, you can connect via social channels as part of that. Nima, any final thoughts from you? Or I know there's been various organizations involved in putting this together and what have you, just before we then dive into the networking.
Be positive and ask the questions. Don't be afraid of asking the questions. Like my mother, I only thought was fantastic. She said, I think this is stupid. Is it? Yeah. Don't be afraid of not knowing. And if someone comes to you and they don't know, explain it to them or point them into the right Wikipedia, because also, as Abs is saying, it's not your responsibility to educate them, but say, try Googling it. You'll find it interesting.
Right, well, thanks everyone. Thank you so much for those able to stay around until 11:30 or just beyond. It's very simple. You can literally click on the networking on the left-hand side. We will depart gracefully from this screen by clicking the leave button and head into the networking zone. Some people have put their contact details in the chat as well. So thank you for doing that. And thank you so much, and speak again soon.
And just to confirm, everyone in the chat, you can join the networking one, and you might even be unfortunate enough to get matched up with me. So.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's your time to get on screen as well. So thanks,
Thank you, everyone. Maybe see some of you in a moment.
Thank you.